Well, the year 2020, I remember in January thinking about the fact that I was very excited about the year 2020. It just had a ring to it. And here we are in June, and I look at 2020 so far, and we've already had to deal with a pandemic that we will deal with for the rest of the year that we didn't expect. And now we've had yet another black man lose his life at the hands of excessive force from law enforcement, which has led to mass demonstrations, as it should, and it's only June. And I look at the year now and I say, well, I'm even more excited about what 2020 will actually turn into. Now, every talk needs a theme, like every talk needs a through line. And the through line for this talk is all about disruption, how we need to embrace it, and then as leaders, the understanding of what will never be the same. Because anytime there's disruption, anytime there's crisis, anytime there is events like we've had at the beginning of the year 2020, it's a chance for leaders to be able to embrace that disruption and drive the change that we'll need to have. But we've got to understand what will never be the same. And so that is the through line that we're going to talk about today. So let's jump right off and look at this from a bit of a historical standpoint. Now, I love history. I mean, I'm a student of go back thousands of years, hundreds of years. I'm a student of the Bible. I'm also a student of everything that's happened in human history. Yet, I'm the founder of a consulting firm called Future Point of View, where we get paid to look into the future accurately. Time frames are important. When you're a leader, time frames are important. It's important to understand where do we come from and what happened, what lessons have we learned. And it's important to be able to look forward and say, hey, what might the future look like? It's important to be in the present. Maybe I could say it to you this way. It's important to have a little bit of a godlike lens on what's going on in life if you're going to be a good leader. We cannot get caught up in the immediate moments. We've got to be able to step back and really look at things from a much bigger picture, a much more godlike picture of where things are going to go. Let me give you an example of that. If we just look over the last 100 years, and we look at some crises that have happened and what it did to us, I can tell you a few stories. I mean, obviously, at the beginning of the 20th century, we had the Spanish flu, which killed millions. Now, we learned coming out of that we needed to do a much better job with healthcare. I saw a picture the other day of a football game back in 1919 where the people were sitting in the stands with white masks. And if you took away the black and white, it probably looked like what a football game is going to look like now. So even though it was 100 years ago, what has changed most is just we learned a lot of lessons about healthcare and about how to stop spreading infectious disease. But spin forward to the Great Depression, right? What did we learn during the Great Depression? That was an era where people got overly exuberant about money and investing. And then when it crashed, for years afterwards, the average family was destitute. And it forever changed people. My grandparents came through the Great Depression. I remember my grandmother would wipe down the tin foil, fold it back up, and put it back in the drawer. My grandmother would use the tea bag 5 times. She wouldn't use it once and throw it away. My grandmother would not throw away a jar because every jelly jar was something that she could use to store things in from that point forward. The Depression changed people. It changed my grandfather, who saved money his entire life, even though he really didn't spend much at all, saved a large amount of money and then gave it all to his family when he died. And that was so important to him because he lived through the Great Depression when everybody lost everything that they had, and he saw what that did to people. World War II, 70 million people killed. The worst war the world has ever seen. And when I say the worst war, it's not just the volume of people who were killed. Think about it for a second, the type of people who were killed. This was not a war where it was a lot of soldiers that were fighting other soldiers. I mean, obviously, in Nazi Germany, there were millions of Jewish women and children that were killed in Auschwitz and Dachau. But what about Leningrad? The Germans blockaded Leningrad. starved out 17 million people. 1/3 of everybody who lived in Leningrad died, many of them women and children. And lest you think that the U.S. is so pure, we dropped 2 atom bombs in the middle of cities in Japan. Who do you think we killed when we dropped the atom bombs in the middle of the cities in Japan? But coming out of World War II, we looked at this and we said, we're horrified, and we created the United Nations. Right? We created a new type of diplomacy that now, from that time to this, we have not had a major world war. Every time we have a crisis, we learn and we grow. I think that is part of God's plan. But when you're in the middle of the crisis, it's sometimes very difficult to understand the context. And it's why I say sometimes we have to step back and have a much larger lens about what's actually happening to us in 2020. And what is it that we're to learn? And how is it that we're to be leaders during this time? Look at historically what's happened. I'll make a comment just about right now the protests. We need protests. The situation isn't getting much better. And so we need protests because it brings people's focus to the fact that rules need to change for law enforcement. But bias in general needs to change. And this is just bringing focus to it. And if we think the protests now are bad, I lived through a time in Cleveland. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio in the 60s when people were protesting Vietnam. I lived in shouting distance from Kent State University. At Kent State, 4 students were gunned down by the National Guard. That was what protests were like when I was a kid. So today people are getting hit with rubber bullets, and I think it's horrible. It's a step better than the kids who were gunned down on the campus of Kent State. We've had protests for thousands of years, and even the protests are getting better and hopefully getting more impactful than what they've been before. We've got to understand as leaders that there is disruption. There's always been disruption. There will always be disruption. As a Christian, I look back in the Bible, and let me give you 2 examples of probably the biggest disruption and the biggest resets that were done by God. The first one, Noah and the ark, where God flooded the world and only saved 2 of every animal and just Noah and his family. That was the first greatest reset, right, that I've read historically. And then there was a second reset. When Jesus died on the cross for us, that was a reset of our sins. That was moving the Spirit inside of us. Probably the greatest reset of ever. And it's important as leaders, though, that we understand. We've been getting the chance to deal with disruption. We've been getting the chance to deal with resets for thousands of years. 2020 is nothing new. And 2020, it's exciting to me because it's a chance for us to take some steps forward and to improve. You know, I've always loved the Chinese kanji character for crisis. If you go back and you look at that, Wei Ji, it's made up of 2 components, right? It's made up of the character for change and the character for opportunity, or pardon me, danger and opportunity. And any crisis, there is that opportunity, right? There is certainly danger from every type of disruption in the world, but then there is also the opportunity that comes out of it. And the difference is leadership. It's just how a leader chooses to handle what happens in a crisis. I'll give you an example. I'm a business person. I know some of you are business people. If we look at this pandemic, the pandemic has been unfair and uneven as far as how it has hit businesses. Some businesses, it has been absolutely tragic for. We have other businesses, they're selling more, doing better than they've ever been before. It's unfair and it's uneven, but it's disruptive to just about everybody in the economy. And we will spend the rest of the year trying to get back to some sense of consistency. So industry dynamics are changing, and it gives us a chance to reset in all of these industries. For example, the travel space will probably not go back to the way the travel space was in 2019. Less people will travel. That's just going to be a reality. They're going to be able to use video more. They're going to drive more. Less people in hotels, less people in rental cars. Right? The travel industry is going to experience a lot of change. Now, we could say that's a horrible thing, right? People being laid off, jobs lost, investments lost. And I would say, sure, all of that is true. And it's also a chance for the travel industry to improve. Take the airlines, for example. I fly a lot. The airlines, really not that fun to work with over the last 3 or 4 years. The more full the airlines were flying, the less they cared about you actually getting to your destination. They were so full, if a flight got canceled, they really did not care if they couldn't get you there for 2 more days. And some of you know what I'm talking about. This is a chance for the airlines to reset and to understand customer service a little bit better, and hopefully come out of this in a better place than what they were like in 2018 and 2019. Now, the entertainment industry, it's going to be a while before people are all willing to go to movie theaters or willing to go to rock concerts or willing to go to even a bowling alley with a lot of people there. They will come back, but how long will it be before they come back to 2019 levels? And we can go through lots of industries. Restaurants. How long will it be before the restaurant industry is able to generate the same amount of revenue they did before? And I would say restaurants will probably never go back to the way they were before. There will be more and more meals that are delivered as opposed to people eating the meals in a room. And it'll impact the lower-end restaurants and the higher-end restaurants differently, because that's what disruption does. Or think about some of the positive things. Healthcare. A lot of people have been forced to do online work with the hospitals, remote care, and they found out that that works pretty well. And so now that avenue will open up in the healthcare space so that we don't have to go into a doctor's office to get some advice. All right, so there are many positive things and there are many things that are negative that have happened in the industry. If you step outside of industry, just think about the dynamics of religious services. You know, churches who have for thousands of years relied on a group of people in person. And will this be the year that less and less people show up to a religious service in person and more people absorb it through other means, videos, podcasts, and that they get their spirituality in a different way? It'll be interesting to see. All of these dynamics are dynamics that will be somewhat reset because of what has happened with the pandemic in 2020. And in many cases, this resetting will be a good thing. But again, it takes a lot from leaders to be able to get us there. Look at us personally. Let's talk about the positive reset from a personal level. Already in the first 6 months of 2020, without really expecting it, there's been a lot of things for a lot of people that have been different. So, for example, we've never responded to a pandemic in this way before. This is the first time ever in humanity that we said, let's pull out all the stops. Let's risk the entire economy. Let's shelter at home, which we've never done before, in order to try to save lives. I mean, let's be clear. We've had pandemics before. We've had diseases that are worse, that transmitted worse than this one, and we did not react this way. It is a great sign for humanity that we chose this time to react this way, to pull out all the stops financially, inconveniencing people in order to save more lives. That's a human reset, and we'll never go back. From now on, every pandemic, we'll get better and better at responding this way to be able to save more and more lives. It's a wonderful thing. This first time around, we didn't do it that well, but we got to learn somehow. Now, I choose to look at things like this and say, this pandemic had a 0.4 morbidity rate, right? Less than 1% of people who got it actually died. For the people who died, it's tragic. The numbers are large. If we look at it, though, in a bigger context, as I tell you it's so important to do, what if the next pandemic has a 20% morbidity rate? What if there's one coming that's much worse than this one? Then we would look at this one and say, thank God we got to practice with COVID in 2020, because that taught us the right way to handle a pandemic, so that when a much worse one came along in 2023, 2024, 2021, we were able to handle it much more eloquently. And again, we will say, thank God that you gave us this chance to practice this one. It's all about how you look at disruption, right? How you perceive, is it a negative or is it a positive? And what is it that we're to learn from this? For example, us personally, a lot of people were given a chance to change their work-life balance. We were given a chance to shelter at home, be at home, and not travel, not go into work every day. Not everybody got this chance, but a lot of people did. And it impacted people. When they did that, a lot of folks said, hey, I'm tired of the rat race. I'm tired of being on the gerbil wheel. I liked being home with my family more. I liked working from home. And they'll choose not to go back. They will reset the way that they look at work-life balance. Is that a bad thing? I mean, corporations are going to change their view on work from home. We'll talk about that some more later. Right? Or think about the fact that we had the ability to touch somebody else taken away from us in a lot of cases, or we had the connection with a lot of other people broken for just some months. But it gave us an appreciation for a hug, right? It just gave us an appreciation for even shaking somebody's hand or even talking to somebody in person. Right? This is what the Great Reset has done for us this year, is it's given us a chance to see things in a different way than we would have seen them in 2019. So again, I thank God for the disruption. There are other things that I think we do need to look at 2020, and as leaders, we need to be careful of. For example, gaps. I think one of the things that has to be reset, and that a crisis like we've seen, or the crises that we have seen so far this year, needs to really ingrain in us, is that there are gaps in society. There's gaps in humanity. There's gaps in the world. And these gaps have to be closed. I'll give you some examples. In COVID, there was a big difference between who was catching it, who wasn't, and who was dying and who wasn't. And so if you look at the data, obviously the wealthier you were, or you are, the less chance you were going to have of catching the disease and dying from disease. The poorer you were, the more chance you would get the disease and die from the disease, which does nothing but, in my opinion, create more of a gap between the wealthy and the people who are not wealthy. Because the people who are not wealthy, they had to continue to do their jobs. They were service workers. They were the ones that were delivering the meals to the wealthy who were sheltered in their big homes. That's a gap, and it's a gap we need to be aware of. No different than a gap in racial tension or bias, a gender gap, right? A religious gap. One of the things we've got to be more mindful of is every time that there is a gap, whether it is between wealthy and poor, young and old, white and black, male and female, anytime there is a gap, and we allow there to be bias in that gap, in other words, that our side is better or our side is right, we have a problem. That is not a God view. That is not the way that we are called to lead. It's not the way we are called to live. And so one of the things I hope people take away from 2020, what we've seen so far, is we need to mind the gap. We need to understand these gaps, and we need to do everything we can to close these gaps. They will not serve us. And if we don't learn this lesson in 2020, we will get this lesson again in 2021 and 2022. We will keep getting this lesson until we learn to close these gaps. It is one of the things we have a chance to do in a great reset, is we have a chance to close the gaps in the world. And I mean gaps in our lives, gaps in society, gaps between government and people who just live in the country or live in the states. We've got to be more mindful of these gaps, and that's part of what I think we're being shown right now. As a leader, I ask myself in 2020, all right, what am I called to do? What do I need to do as a leader? And I will say that one of the biggest things that I think we are called to do is understand a bigger picture. As I told you, I had no idea at the beginning of 2020 that this year was going to be like this year, and I'm sure you didn't either. But I had a choice to make back in January or February when the pandemic started to unfold. I had a choice to make about how did I deal with and how did I lead people through this time. I remember there was a moment where I was sitting at home, and it really came upon me, the weight came upon me, the gravity of the situation came upon me, that this was going to get worse. and that this was going to be a dramatic reset for people, and it was going to cause a massive amount of disruption. And when I saw that states and the federal government were ordering people to shelter at home, and I did the quick math on what that meant, and I could see right away the businesses it was going to hurt, the people who lost their jobs. The gravity set in on me, and I remember that moment. And I was sitting there asking myself, all right, I'm a leader, what do I do? And I had a talk with myself, and I said, well, one of the things that you got to do as a leader is you're going to have to be a purveyor of hope. You're going to have to be somebody who lifts up the people around you. You're going to have to be strong through this. Right? But I will tell you, at the end of that conversation that I had with myself, where I started writing down some action items of things that I was going to do, and I created a list of these are all the things I'm going to do, and I did them for the next 2 or 3 months. One of the biggest things that I said to myself is, I got to learn my lessons, right? I got to learn. I got to learn what is it that I can take away from this crisis? What is it for me to learn, and then what is it for us to learn? Humanity improves one crisis at a time. That's just a reality. I thank God that we don't have to have a Noah-type crisis again, where God looks down at us and says, I got to start over. I thank God that we're not in that place anymore, because every crisis now that we think is so bad is tiny compared to what God had to do back then. It's tiny. It's just hard for us to see it, because if it's your company that got closed down and your dream was shattered because of this, then it seems like a huge thing to you. If you lost your job, then this seems like a huge thing to you, and I understand that. And I don't want to minimize any of that. But I do think it's critical as leaders that we understand that disruption is a steady state. There are peaks and valleys. There are rarely just times for years and years where things are steady. I mean, I'm almost 60 years old, right? Told you I grew up in the 60s. I have watched crisis come over and over and over again. Every few years, whether it's a financial crisis or it's some existential crisis. I've watched racism in the 60s be much worse than it is today, but it's not done being repaired yet. But it is better, right? I have the perspective of being able to see that we've had crisis after crisis after crisis. And in every case, if we would just learn our lessons and get better, then eventually maybe we can stop having all the crisis. And as leaders, that's, I think, the most important thing we have to do, is ask, what am I to learn from this? What will never be the same? What do I want to never be the same? And what is it that I need to learn from this? So for you, I'd love for you to give some thought to that. I'd love for you to think about, so far, 6 months in to 2020, 2 major events. 2 events where we need to learn. How do we need to handle these things different in the future? And what can you do as a leader? What is it that you're learning? What is the disruption doing for you? What will never be the same for you? This is what a leader must do, is we must be thoughtful about these things at this time.